I've never been accused of being quiet. So it's really great to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Leo, and nice to be with everyone here. I was a member of the UFT in New York and the CTU in Chicago, and so it's nice to be in the headquarters of the AFT. I start this story or my contribution today from a practitioner lens, from a teacher kind of perspective. I started teaching in the South Bronx also at an amazing school called Fannie Lou Hamer Freedom High School, if anyone's familiar. And I think that experience gave me an understanding of what is possible in schools when you start from the experiences, interests, and communities of the young people that we serve. And you start from the perspective that the young people who are coming to us have a lot to offer. They know a lot, they have a lot of experiences, their communities do, and when we foster learning environments where they are central and where they are contributors to what we're learning and they are part of that process, you can see how powerful that is and how much further we go. And so I went from, the South Bronx back to Chicago, where I'm from, and continued to do work around civic engagement and eventually ended up down at the district office helping to support the development of a civic engagement initiative, which included a civics course and some student voice work and environmental service learning and those kinds of things. And we built from a lot of the work that the civic ed field had done around these 6 promising practices, a lot of the work that Peter and others contributed to. It was a real argument for us to say, hey, there's not equitable opportunities, and Ted, there's not an equitable opportunity for young people to get these really great practices. And so in Chicago, we're gonna give it to them. And so we made this great curriculum that we were really proud of called Participate. It had the practices, it had really compelling questions. We sent it out into the world, did PD. And then I got to go to classrooms and it's hard when you make something and you're really excited about it and then you see it and you're like, oh. And so the O for us was we were not explicit. The essential question of the curriculum is who has power in a democracy, how did they get it and how do they use it? And we asked students by the end of the course to say what's their power, what are the issues that they're passionate about, and how do they intend to engage? How do they intend to participate? But we didn't tell teachers explicitly, although I assumed they would, hey, you might want to ask students and talk about issues like race and identity, issues of real importance in the city of Chicago, which has a lot of stuff going on. And so I'd go to classrooms and you'd see these really kind of benign topics being engaged and students with blank stares, and it's disappointing because you're excited, these things are good. And I'm going to share a story of one classroom that really affected me, affected our team, and pushed us towards writing the paper, Let's Go There, that you guys have in your packet. So I walked into a classroom, predominantly, actually 100% of the students in the classroom were African American, the teacher's a white woman, who grew up in a neighborhood not far from this particular neighborhood. And she was having a discussion around citizen typology, the Westheimer and Kahn idea of 3 kinds of citizen. And there was a discussion in the classroom about what to do with issues of violence in the community. And so the students were sharing what they thought should happen. And I was working with a group of students in the back that said they weren't really into the civics class, this wasn't really their deal, and they didn't like it at all. And I said, well, let's just talk about it. And they started to get excited thinking about how they might address the issue of violence, which comes up a lot in Chicago. And the student was starting to talk about how the students in the community need to take the lead on some issues. So but he didn't want to share. We got to the point where he shared this. Another student said, we need more police officers because they're going to help us address this problem if there's more of them. And the student I was working with was hesitant, but he raised his hand and he said, I don't think the police are part of the solution because I don't have good experiences with them and neither do other people in my neighborhood, and we don't feel like I don't feel like that's really gonna help us. They only further I don't trust them. The teacher intervened and said, well, if you would start behaving well and acting appropriate, then they wouldn't bother you so much. And you need to understand that the police are here to protect and serve, and it's your responsibility to act appropriately. And the student looked at me leaned back, and then didn't talk the rest of the class, said I told you so on the way out, and asked if I could come back again because he wanted to keep talking about it, but he didn't think this was a classroom where he was going to get to talk about it. And I went to the parking lot and stared out the window for a little while before I could drive, because it crushed me that a student walks away from this classroom that we were so excited about with this idea that what he knows and experiences isn't valid, that his experiences aren't recognized as something that's important, and that actually he might not be part of the solution after all. So that experience really marked, and that's not the only one, but it's one that I think crystallizes what the reason that we wrote Let's Go There, and that is that it really does, an argument for centering race, ethnicity, identity in civics ed is not just because we want to be more relevant, although that's important. It affects the way young people learn if we don't center and make sense of and help them sort through the actual experiences that they have. And so one of the co-authors of the paper, Kathy Cohen, has been doing a lot of work recently around these ideas of political knowledge and what is knowledge, right? How do we articulate? There's a lot of these conversations sometimes in the civics meetings about, is this a knowledge versus skills question, which, teachers don't have these because you got to have them all because you got to teach and you need some knowledge and some skills and some application. And but what she kind of articulates in her research is that we need to reconceptualize what is taken for granted political knowledge. And when she started to do surveys of young people and she created a different construct of political knowledge on knowledge of the carceral state, right? And knowledge of, and you compare that knowledge with kind of this traditional liberal democratic face of the state, and actually white youth have much lower levels of political knowledge around the carceral state than black youth. Why? Probably because of the interactions that they have, whereas white youth tended to score higher on kind of more traditional forms of political knowledge. It makes us ask, what is the knowledge even that's being put in our curriculum? What are we taking for granted as like, this is what one needs to know? And whose experiences are we pushing forward and whose are we pushing back? And so that this kind of work for us really asks us to rethink how we conceive of civic ed. And I'll quickly, I think am I low on time? You're good. Okay. The principles that we put forth in the paper, and so myself, Kathy Cohen, and Joe Kahn, who's a civic ed scholar from UC Riverside, kind of wrote this together. We spent time doing focus groups with young people. We interviewed different scholars, but also practitioners and folks in the community to kind of pull these principles. And the four of them start with the premise that young people have a great deal of knowledge and expertise that need to be centered and leveraged in the classroom for learning, and that's really important. And so any approach to civics has to start from that premise. The second is that the curriculum has to be constructed and developed with race, identity, and lived experience as central to the learning. And again, this learning that we had in Chicago is that if we didn't say it, if we didn't put it there, it's very easy to not include. It's this implicit, like, oh, folks will get there, they're not. And so we need to put central to the curriculum that this is important. And I'll give a little anecdote of that, building off of what you were sharing earlier, Peter. In Kathy's research, one of the questions asked about what does the Confederate flag symbolize? And so one of the options was Southern pride, and the other option was a symbol of racism and bigotry. And not surprisingly, white youth tended to see the Confederate flag as a symbol of Southern pride, and black youth, Latino youth, and Asian youth all saw it as a symbol of racism and hatred. So how are we teaching these things in the curriculum? How are they positioned is important. The third thing that was really important in our paper was this idea that context matters. And this is something that we in CPS and lots of other folks have talked about. Civics is not a class only. It has to be something that the entire school takes up. It's the job of everybody. And when we were trying to support schools in the district, we didn't leave it just to high schools. We said, elementary schools, this is your job too. We said, this is the job of science teachers and math teachers and PE teachers and arts teachers, and actually the security guard and the women, folks who work in Chicago it's largely women, but the cafeteria workers, the school safety officer, any of these people, their job is also civic ed, right? And that we need to think about the context of schools. So if I walk into a building where I am confronted with all kinds of ways that I'm told to be quiet, sit still, walk through a metal detector, don't raise your hand unless you're sitting in a certain way and looking a certain, if we kind of hyperstructure these ways that young people interact in every classroom, what learning do they have about their role in democracy or the power of their voice or how they express themselves? So context of the school really matters. And in classrooms, that means shifting also who gets to be in charge all the time. And teachers, it's hard for us to cede control, but this idea that we're going to rethink how classrooms work and how young people help co-construct learning instead of the recipients of sitting in rows. And then the last thing is that really this requires a lot of support for educators, for all of us, right? A tremendous amount of ongoing, relevant, and kind of reflective professional learning. And that means we're not just going to here's the curriculum, here's how it works, and go. Teachers need to think about what are their identities, how are they positioned, how are they interacting with young people, what are their narratives, because identity and race isn't just about marginalized young people, it's also about the teachers in front of them who come in with certain privileges and positions and experiences that impact how learning happens in the classroom. And so we think this work is really hard to do, and we are not we didn't take the position that teachers are bad and they're doing something wrong. We did this is something we all have to do together and we all have to grow together. And so that would be the kind of fourth thing. And I think, the paper is out there. The district in Chicago I've now left, but they have taken up this work and are thinking about how they engage teachers in pursuing this. And we don't think that this is like you put a strategy in place, but I do think this is actually part of this larger discussion of how we imagine and engage in what it looks like to move the civic ed field forward. If we're not cognizant of these issues, we're missing the opportunity to really to get to the outcomes that we say we want, which is for all young people to be engaged and participating.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica, and right on time as well. Let's turn now to Robert.